10:30 a.m. So let's get started. I'm just going to be with you for the housekeeping items, the logistics, and then I will pass over the microphone uh, to Sulan. So first of all, welcome everyone. So what you're saying, we're excited to start this conversation on microplastics. And before getting into business, some logistics as usual. We will ask you to keep your microphone muted and to please put your questions and comments through the chat box. We want to remind you that the webinar session is being recorded. Unless we receive any objections, the recording, the presentation, and the Q&A will be uploaded to the Spark Loop platform to the link that my colleague Amro will be sharing with you through the chat box. Being said that, I will pass over the microphone to Sulan to formally start this session. Sulan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Hello, everyone. My name is Sulan. I am the lead of the Global Plastics Task Force. On behalf of the task force, welcome to this session on microplastics. For those of you who joined for the first time, the purpose of this webinar series is to facilitate global learning and sharing and inform the development of UNDP's plastics offer. I think you may wonder why do we need an offer? First, I think this is not a choice. It's the situation that has posed to a challenge to us. Plastic pollution is negatively affecting the many SDGs and some of the key strategic areas that UNDP is working on, particularly in ecosystem-based solutions and marine environment. Second, we think that UNDP has some unique contribution to make to the world and offer our strengths and value to the world. We are present in 170 countries as a large development network, working from the community level, talking to informal waste management sector people, up to the cabinet, and linking up to the global practitioners and the thought leaders that like what we have today. I think the ability of UNDP to integrate vertically these actions from local community up to the global level is unique and can be powerful in terms of bringing people together, providing contextualized national solutions as well as a global contribution. And the third reason is that actually, even though we never had a plastics offer or strategy before, UNDP has done tremendously. Because of the decentralized nature, UNDP has developed 119 projects related to solid waste management and plastics management, including with more than $500 million funding. And at the community level, through GF Small Grants Program, we have supported since 1993, 780 projects at the community level. With such a large effort going on, we really, I think, our impact could be even more and larger and more fundamentally. So there's a need to integrate our effort. And the question is how? So this is a big piece of puzzle that we together need to figure out how we can organize better and how we can contribute to the global plastic pollution, to addressing the crisis. And that is why we are here today. And we're here to open our ears and eyes and listen to 3 of the world's leading scientists and the practitioners. So with that, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Christian Severin. Chris is the coordinator for JEF's International Waters Focal Area Coordinator. So since 2005, Chris has been working with JEF. He's managing and catalyzing the regional cooperation and investment across many different regions. Chris has been working with the JEF on providing global financing of $1.9 billion in grant and $10.6 billion in co-financing. Countries participating in GEF International Waters projects have successfully negotiated numerous regional cooperation frameworks, treaties, and protocols. And before joining GEF, Chris worked on nature-based solutions, wastewater management, drinking water-related issues in private sector. Chris, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange. Thank you for those introductory remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining today. I must admit, I'm standing in for one of my friends that are indeed, and one of my colleagues that are indeed a real, true thought leader in plastics. But I mean, I'll try to do my very best here. We have, of course, since plastic in many, I guess, everywhere in the world, is borne by water from point A to B. It is an issue, of course, that has touched upon transboundary cooperation many times. But what is fascinating me with the subject we're going to be listening on today here is that, I mean, the plastic agenda is unfortunately fairly new in relation to pollution, right? It happened over the last decade, two maybe, that it become a big issue, and over the last 5 years, it's taken, you know, a full spin, which is fantastic. We're getting a lot of political attention to the issue, and I think that political attention, especially to ocean plastics, have enabled other communities of practice to start, such as microplastics, which barely was, you know, a discipline back in 2012. But today it has a distinct set of researchers, and we will listen to a couple of them here today, and many and a whole, you know, a suite of actors in the private sector and other places that are trying to see what can be done with this. And it is very, very it is not as easy a subject matter to deal with, and that's why it's really good that we at least try to cover some of the bases today. I'm not sure where we will end up. I guess that's up to all of you participants. We'll be getting some academic stimulation in a little bit, and then I hope that you're all awake and ready to kick some good questions the other way, so we can hear what issues you're facing with this. I think that's really important. So anyway, with that, I mean, I know we will need some massive transformational shifts in order to deal with this part, the microplastics, as well as plastics in general. I don't know what the fix is. I think the fix is going to be a suite of many things. It's going to be, you know, many different actors coming together to find out how do we deal with this. But for that to happen, we need somebody to carry the torch, and I guess that's you guys here today. So, I mean, thank you so much for joining. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Julian. Julian is a sustainability entrepreneur and expert, and has been working within this space for more than 15 years. He has been, you know, working on modeling both micro and macro plastic pollution for a long time, and so he's a thought leader within this, and we're looking very much forward to hear you kick us into the sea of microplastics. Julian.
So hello everyone. So I'm trying to move to the next slide here. So I will try to share with you some of my experience with different projects related to microplastics, and mainly try to answer what is a microplastic and how much microplastics are out there in the environment, and mainly in the ocean. So we are a research consultancy based in Switzerland, fully independent and funded by projects. We have been working in different directions. So one is, of course, trying to understand better the phenomenon, so doing research and development on what's happening with microplastics, where they are, etc. And also, of course, trying to better understand what are the current methodologies to measure or forecast this phenomenon. You can see a few of our publications, and I will take some examples from these publications during my presentation. We also have been running pilot projects in multiple countries or with corporate stakeholders to assess the plastic leakage, the plastic footprint. And we are now in the process of making all this information available in a data platform called Plastics that will be released next month. And finally, in terms of tools that are like the end product of our work, we have now these 3 tools that we contributed to. So one is a country guidance published by UNEP and IUCN, which is a support for countries how to assess their plastic footprint and try to mitigate it. We have a similar document, but this time targeting corporates or product designers, which is the plastic leak guidance. And recently published last week is an additional guidance which is more focusing on communication and claims, again, more targeting the private sector. So I will try to go through these main topics. So the definition of microplastic, what are the sources, what are the stocks, and maybe tools and recommendations. So definition. So if you look at microplastic, or if you look at the ocean and hope to see the plastic, probably this is what you will see. And still it's full of plastics. And why? It's because a lot of the plastic out there is not visible. We say only 1% is somehow visible. The rest is in the form of tiny particles we call microplastics. These particles that are with a size below 5 millimeters, they can be in the form of particulates, beads, like that. They can be in the form of fibers from textile or ropes, things like that. So there are in fact 2 types of microplastics. If you look on the right side of this scheme, some are directly released in the form of microplastic in the environment. For example, the fibers shedding from textile during washing, they are directly released in the micro form in the environment. And we call them, or I call them in this presentation, primary microplastics. And some other are resulting from the degradation of larger objects, larger waste, once they are already in the environment due to fragmentation and UV exposure, etc. And this is what we call secondary microplastics. So in a way, all plastics that ends up in the environment, either in micro or macro form, will become microplastics. It's a question of time. What are the sources? And I will mainly focus here on the primary microplastics. So in this report published in 2017, we were amongst the first to do a global assessment of how much are the primary microplastics contributing to the total plastic leakage. And you can see here that the release, so what ultimately ends up into the environment, is between 0.8 and 2.5 million tons per year, which is with a central value of 1.5. And if you compare that to the leakage from mismanaged waste, this is a Jambek result, you can see that we all know the number of 8 million tons. So still it's a very significant number, 1.5 million tons compared to 8 million tons coming from primary microplastics. There are multiple sources of these microplastics. You can see here the distribution that we have found in our modeling. So to make it simple, we have 1/3 coming from tire abrasion, 1/3 coming from textile fibers shedding during washing, and 1/3 from other sources, paint, cosmetics. There are multiple sources. Another interesting, so this is again a recap of it. You can see that the total plastic production worldwide is a bit above 400 million tons, either in the form of fiber or pellets for plastic manufacturing or synthetic rubber. And out of that, around 12 million tons is leaking, so 8 from the mismanaged waste in coastal areas, 2 from inland leakage, and the rest is fishing activities, maritime sources, and the 1.5 megatons from primary microplastics. This altogether makes 3% of all the plastic produced that is leaking, and quite a significant amount in the form of primary microplastics, knowing that ultimately all this plastic will become micro due to fragmentation. The situation is quite different from one area, one country to the other, because of course in countries where we know the waste management is not appropriate, leakage from plastic waste, macroplastics, is dominating. But in some other countries like in Europe or North America, microplastics actually are dominating the total leakage. It's more than the leakage from waste. This is very different again from one country and one source to another. In some, like in Asia, leakage from fiber is dominating due to high consumption of synthetic textile, higher than average, when in North America, for example, and Europe, leakage from tire is more important because of high traffic and high mobility of the people, higher mobility. So this was from our study. Just as a reference, you can see other studies. This one from UNEP with quite similar results, even more for microplastics. Oops, sorry, I made a mistake. This is the most recent study from Pew Systemic, where I was also involved as expert. And you can see that it provides the leakage in 2016, 1.3 million tons from microplastics, so quite similar to the 1.5 we had. And interestingly, it's also providing a forecasting of what's going to happen by 2040 in a business as usual scenario. You can see that this leakage is increasing, more than doubling in this model. In this publication, the split between the different sources was a bit different, with a higher contribution of the tire dust with respect to the other sources, but still all these sources were described. And in terms of action, this report also describes multiple pathways that we can take to mitigate the leakage, like better design of products, of course, because of tire dominating, change in transportation system, decrease in plastic production, preventing in leakage like the primary pellets. Water treatment is key in this topic because a lot of the leakage is making its way through wastewater, and of course ban of intentional microplastics, like in the cosmetics. Interestingly, in the modeling solutions, we have found solutions for most of the issues except for the tire. And this is why in this scenario analysis in 2040, a lot of the leakage that is remaining after putting in place some action is coming from the tires. So innovation is really needed in this field because there is no appropriate solution at this stage for this very big leakage source. Now, in terms of stocks, just to show you how real this leakage is, if you look at what is out there in the environment, we took this. I take this example. It's from Lake Geneva, so it's a very interesting model because it's a closed system. It's much easier to study than an ocean. And we did the study to try to compare the results of the model that we did, which is a top-down approach, with a bottom-up approach, which is how much is found there, how much is found in the rivers, in the different pathways, and try to see if it matches. So we did the study. This is the result of the top-down approach. You can see that about 50 tons of plastics are released in the lake. You can see 30 from the tires, and the rest is waste and textile and construction, etc. So around 50-55 tons. Then we did the same with measuring the actual concentration and extrapolating to the inflow in the lake from river discharge, urban runoff, storm overflows, different sources. And we found that it's matching, We also looked at what is accumulated in the water column, in the sediments, and also we have something which is around 600 tons accumulated in the lake, with a yearly input of 55 tons per year. So it's really quite plausible in terms of order of magnitudes. So this is to present the results. So in a way, the estimation, the modeling is still gross, but we can see that the more we go, the more we can see that it's an order of magnitude that is realistic. Same has been done on the the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see that we did a literature review to try to assess how much microplastics and plastic are accumulated, and only a little fraction is at the sea surface, less than 1%, and most of the plastic is actually found in microplastic form or macroplastic form on the seafloor. Another study, I think very, very important study that was published this summer in Nature. It's a study from another group that did a survey in Atlantic Ocean by measuring also the concentrations in the water column and doing a mass balance of the inputs versus how much is stocked in the Atlantic Ocean, and it's also matching. So it's really interesting, and it shows that there are several hundreds thousand tons of plastic accumulated, several 100 million tons accumulated in the ocean. So it's really real numbers that
really
are measured.
Just a little time. There's like 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
So I go to my conclusion. So this is about the tools. I mentioned them already, and I can leave that for questions if you have some questions. But I wanted to take 1 minute to go through next steps and what are my recommendations. So I think this is still quite a new topic, and I think increasing awareness and is still an important aspect of it, especially for the tire leakage, which is not so well known. Also, there are additional sources of microplastic leakage that should be better understood, like paints, we are working on it, or agricultural plastics, for example. Of course, last other point, and we are going to speak about that now with Paulina, is how dangerous is this? And better understanding the impacts on human health and ecosystems is key. We are still lacking data transparency. I guess this is a key aspect of all the plastic topics. So improving transparency and the quantities that are used by industries and countries is something really important. And finally, in terms of solution, we should really aim for non-end of pipe solution to these issues by really better designing the products to avoid shedding of plastics during use or maintenance. So this is it for my presentation, and happy to have some questions after Paulina's presentation.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I think that this was very enlightening. Unfortunately, not very not a very positive set of messages here. I guess it just lets us put it right in our face that this is indeed a massive issue that needs to be tackled from many different fronts. On your point on transparency of data, data is what drives, and should be driving at least, political change. But I do think one of the main issues here is that countries and municipalities and so forth simply do not have the data. One thing is we can agree that we should share the data, but I think that most countries do not really know what is there. Maybe they can tally up what's coming in the waste streams from municipal collection systems, but that's probably it, right? And from there on, it just goes haywire. Just looking at how the system is in the States, I always is flabbergasted when I see how they deal with their plastic waste here. But anyway, that's a different story. So now we're going to be listening to Paulina. She is an associate professor at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, where she is, among many other things, chemicals, fertility of women, and so forth, also are looking at endocrine disruptors and some of the effects of microplastics. So, Paulina?
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this global webinar series on plastics. So my name is Pauliina Damdimopoulou, and I am based at Karolinska Institute, which is a medical university in Stockholm in Sweden. For about 20 years, I have been interested in hormonal systems, hormonal health, and the impact of the environment on that. And currently, I'm leading a research group that focuses on the impact of hormone-active chemicals on fertility in women. If you are interested in this topic, you can check out my research group homepage that is given on this slide and find out exactly what we are doing. But today, I will be introducing a guide that we wrote. Now I did the mistake of pressing too many times. Yes. So this is very sensitive. I swear I only click once. Okay. So a few years back, I was invited to write a report on plastics, chemical additives, and health. And this report was coordinated by IPEN and the Endocrine Society. Endocrine Society is the largest organization for all professionals, clinicians, and researchers working with hormonal health and humans. And I was a member of this 6-author team, and we summarized what we found in the literature about the chemical additives in plastics and what connections we can make to human health. And in this talk, I will briefly introduce you to the topic of toxicity testing and chemicals. I will go deeper into endocrine disruption and then summarize what we know about chemical additives in plastics and their possible human health effects, and then summarize by visioning a few actions that we could perhaps take to reduce all these risks. So the problem with chemicals is that there are very many of them. I'm sorry, I don't know how to control this reasonably. It always hops over 2 slides. Thank you. So, very few of the chemicals on the market have been tested for possible health effects. And it is actually difficult to even know how many chemicals we have in the global market. So I'm using here numbers from the European Union because we have some inventories of the chemicals in commerce. So according to estimates, we are having about 100,000 different chemicals in the European Union. And if you look at the figure, it says that only 500 of these have been extensively tested for possible risks for human health. And approximately 70,000 chemicals we know virtually nothing about, but they are there in the commerce anyway. And the numbers are very vast. And we also should understand that whenever the risks have been estimated, they have been done so following internationally accepted guidelines and only for those adverse health outcomes where we have the guidelines in place. And one of the type of toxicities where we don't really have a good battery of test methods yet is the endocrine disruptive chemicals or the hormone disruptive properties. So this is a type of toxicity which is not systematically tested when it comes to the chemicals. So hormone disruptive chemicals are any chemicals that interfere with the hormonal system in our bodies. And I'm trying to get to my next slide. Yes. So any hormone that will mimic or block or interfere with the hormonal system in our bodies would be classified as an endocrine disruptive chemical. In the picture, you can see all these organs and endocrine glands in humans that produce hormones. And on the bottom of the figure, you see the prototypical sex steroids, testosterone, estradiol, but there's many more control all aspects of our health. The endocrine system is in charge of fetal development, early development after birth, brain development, our metabolism, and of course reproduction. And it is quite well known now that it is the early developmental stages that are particularly sensitive to disruption by chemicals. So if fetus is exposed to endocrine disruptive chemicals, the developing organs might be damaged in a way that leads to lifelong consequences for the health of the individual. And this is something quite typical for the endocrine disruptive properties, that the exposure might have taken place very early on in the development, but the adverse health outcome is only obvious later on in life. For example, if the reproductive organs are exposed and get disrupted by the chemicals during development, we will only see the infertility issues later on when the individual is old enough to try to have a family. So many types of chemicals can be EDCs, and they could be anything from pesticides and fungicides to industrial chemicals used in plastics.
Alina, if you want, we can go back to basics, so you just indicate the next slide and I will pass.
I think that would be better. I don't know why it's hopping over 2 slides when I click.
No worries.
We'll go to the next slide, please. Yes. So many types of chemicals can be endocrine disruptive, anything from the fungicides and pesticides to plastic additives and flame retardants and so forth. And there's clear associations in human populations between exposure to these type of chemicals and, for example, neurological conditions like learning disabilities, obesity, diabetes, and reproductive issues. And it is challenging to try to estimate the impact on the societies in terms of diseases and associated costs. I show here one attempt to estimate the costs in the European Union. This report came out a couple of years ago, and it suggests that the cost of inaction, if we don't regulate these chemicals, is about 157 billion euros a year. And this number is now broken down by the health effect on the left side of the graph and by the chemicals type on the right side. So the leading health effect is the neurological developmental disorders like lost IQ points, attention difficulties, and learning disabilities. And this is followed by obesity and diabetes, and even premature death and reproductive disorders. And if we look at the other side of the graph, what are the types of chemicals associated? Pesticides are the leading culprit here, followed by typical plastic additives, the phthalates and bisphenols, and flame retardants. So plastics and chemicals are closely interlinked, and we can look at the next slide. So plastics, I'm sure you learned during this webinar that plastics are used in extremely many diverse different applications, from medical industry to packaging to cars to buildings, and all these different properties the plastics need to have are met with chemical additives. Chemicals are added to the polymer to make them soft or make them rigid, to make them resist fire, give them colors, to stabilize them, as biocides, fillers, foamers, you name it. And chemicals are such an integral part of plastics that we can even see that the growth of the plastic production and the chemical industry are very closely interlinked, as you can see in the picture on the right side. Now, we don't have comprehensive catalogs of chemicals used in plastics, but what we know is that at least 100 different chemicals that we know to be hazardous for human health are being used as additives in plastics. And these hazardous properties have been assigned by, for example, the European Union or the Chemicals Agency. So we know that these additives that are used could be, for example, carcinogenic to humans or mutagenic or so forth. And on the top of the chemicals we add to plastics are also impurities that follow the additives, so chemicals that we don't intentionally put in, but don't come anyway with the other additives, or that the plastic polymer is not completely polymerized, so we have the monomers floating around in the plastic product as well. You might have heard of the bioplastics, and unfortunately bioplastics contains additives as well because they need to have the same properties as the conventional plastics. And if you now think of the most common types of additives used, that would be bisphenols and phthalates and flame retardants. And in some cases, it is actually a bit misleading to call these additives because they actually constitute the majority of the plastic product by weight. So in some types of plastics, like in PVC, the phthalates can go up to 80% of the final product weight. And most of these additives are not bound to the plastic structure, so they can actually leach out of the product. You can go to the next slide. So here I just give a brief summary of these three main categories of chemicals and the associated health effects. And I really hope that you will check out the full report that is really available online, because you will find so much more information there. But bisphenols, phthalates, and flame retardants are all large families of chemicals, and I give you here a prototypical example from each category. So bisphenol A is a high production volume chemical in the world that is used in food containers, food can linings, thermal papers, and water pipes. And in humans, the exposure has been linked to obesity and insulin resistance, reduced fertility, the brain development disorders, and even cancer. Phthalates are used in flexible plastics. Here, the example structure is DEHB. It's also used in medical tubing and food packaging and children's toys. And it is also linked to obesity and diabetes in human populations. It disrupts the sex steroid levels, and that leads to infertility both in men and women. And there is also a linkage to a condition called endometriosis in women, which is a disturbance in the uterus that makes it more difficult to become pregnant. And the last category here is the flame retardants. This is an even more diverse group of chemicals. I give you an example of a brominated flame retardant called DecaBDE. And this type of chemicals are often used in electronic equipment, in building materials and textiles, where there is a higher risk of fire. So the chemicals will then reduce or change the ignition point of the product so that it's more fire safe. And these have been linked primarily to intellectual disability, lost IQ points, for example, and then reproductive tract malformations and testis cancer, and of course also infertility. And all the examples here, PBA, DHB, and DecaBDE, have been labeled as hazardous chemicals in the European Union. The two first ones are endocrine disruptive and reprotoxic, and the last one is bioaccumulative and toxic. So they are regulated, but there are a lot of loopholes, and they can still be used in many products despite these regulations. Next slide, please. So exposure to plastic additives can, of course, take place throughout the life cycle of the product, from the production to the consumer use and the recycling stage. And the recycling now requires some extra attention. So a part of plastics are incinerated, and this will lead to release of some of the additives to atmosphere, and even new types of toxins will be formed in the product when it's burned. A tiny part is recycled, and this is problematic because we don't always know what additives are in the products, and they end up then entering the plastic product chain again. So all those toxic chemicals that are in the product and we don't know about will be recycled, and they end up in a new product that might be a toy for a child, for example. And we know that the vast majority of the plastic waste will end up in landfills and eventually in the oceans and become microplastics that we just heard everything about in the previous presentation. We can put the next slide, please. From the chemical point of view, I just wanted to say about microplastics that they do end up on our plates. It is the fish and shellfish in the oceans that will filter these microplastics, and then we eat them and we get them in our food. And of course, the microplastic can be any plastic material containing any additives that were there from the first place. But a very scary feature about the microplastics is that they're like sponges. They can absorb even more chemicals from the ocean water. So not only do they have the additives that were there in the first place, but they can even absorb metals from the water. They can take pesticides or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, even more toxic chemicals. So they kind of magnify the chemicals. And now if we think of the human health effects, they of course relate back to these chemicals, the endocrine disruptors and other toxicants that are there. So what can we do about all these problems? And that's my next slide. So you saw the figure projecting the growth of the plastic industry, and already today we don't know what to do with all the waste. So I think one of the main things to do is to try to reduce the production and use of plastics as much as we ever can. And we, of course, should regulate the use of these known hazardous chemicals as additives in plastics. And also we need more transparency, because currently we don't exactly know what additives are used in the product. So they need to be clearly labeled so that we know what we could recycle and what not. And of course, if you know that the plastic has a lot of EDCs or other toxic chemicals, it shouldn't be recycled at all. And throughout this process, we have to always remember that the exposures and effects are not uniform in the population. We have, first of all, the sensitive life stages, the fetuses, the children, pregnant women that should have particular protection. And then also we know that in the society, the exposure at large is usually more focused on the underprivileged groups, and they then face also higher health effects. And this should be taken into consideration in any regulations. And I will end with my last slide, where I just once again show this guide. It is much longer, it has so much more information than this short presentation, so please have a look. Translations will follow shortly. And I really want to thank the Endocrine Society and the co-authors for this opportunity to contribute to the guide and to talk here today. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And I would say that you could probably pick it up out of the coffee table, right? In the break, I'm assuming. No, there's not going to be any of those, unfortunately. We'll have to do with downloading it where we can find that report and the reports that Julian talked about as well. I'm just wondering, just a reflection you said on the, if we get more transparency on what is actually in the plastic products themselves, that would also, we would need a massive capacity building effort for the general public to actually understand what that would mean, so they could start, deselecting those products that would have certain compounds in them. I mean, of course, that's part, and I could see that happening in some parts of the world, but I would also see that would be a very, very large step that needs to be taken if you lift that on a global level. But I mean, of course, we should try to set the bar high, and I agree that's one way to do it. The European Union would probably be one of the first places to adopt something like that, but I could see there would be other places in the world where it would be a little more tricky. So the chat is open with questions. I would also encourage you to raise your hands in the bar, and I'll do my very best. I'll not be reading a lot what's in the chat itself, but I'll be looking out for raised hands. So if there's anyone here that has a clarifying question, I've seen a lot being raised in the chat box, but please ask for the floor and ask a succinct, short question so we can have time for more reflections. Apparently people are stunned. They're in shock. And it is a little bit gloomy. I mean, we heard two reports here that are that are not painting a rosy morning picture. It's a call for action, you could say, instead. And I think that's where UNDP is well situated to do that, and maybe with other partners, especially national partners. But so far, no questions. So let's see. Let me see what's in the chat, if there's anything here. Edwin is asking Paulina, in your opinion, GBBPA is going to be considered a POP?
That was a very specific question. So
Indeed.
the tetrabromobisphenol A, which is one of the replacement flame retardants, I think this is a very important issue that is raised, and that would be that when we phase out some of the more toxic flame retardants, for example, in this case, then we still need to have a similar function in the product, and then newer compounds like TBBPA are introduced. Whether this will be considered, I'm afraid I would not be able to answer.
No, that's probably a more political decision, but anyway, it's a good question there. Guillermo, please.
Yes, hello. This is a question to Julian that I have been looking for some years now. What is the rate, if there is a way to determine the rate of macroplastics degradation into micro? Because if you only find 8 million tons, about that amount in the seas, and the amount produced is about 150 million tons per year, where do the other 95%, or where does it go?
Yeah.
The question, please.
So there are some, I mean, the fate of the plastic once it's in the environment, in terms of how fast it's going to be fragmented and degraded, all this stuff for different types of polymers and etc. is not really well known, and I think I cannot really answer the question. Now, in terms of mass balance, just to clarify, so the 8 million tons is the flux of plastic that is, we believe is flowing in the ocean every year, which means that the stock in the ocean should be much bigger, several hundreds of millions of tons. And I agree with you that there have been like a lot of controversy in the last years, and with speaking about where is the missing plastic, all this stuff, because when you look at only what is at the surface of the ocean by trawling, you will only find a few 100,000 tons of plastics. And that's why I cited this publication in Nature. If you want to do the proper mass balance, and that's also what we did in Lake Geneva and in the Med, you have to look at not only what is at the surface, but also what is within the water column. And in this case, it's more in the form of nanoplastic or much smaller sizes. So you need to measure them. And also what is on the bottom. And the recent papers, in a way, are quite interesting because they show that if you take all these compartments of the environment on one side and on second side, you also look at the smaller size fractions, you more or less recover your mass balance. So it's a good news for the modeler, but it's a bad news for the environment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm on. Yeah, this is a question to Paulina. Thank you very much for that interesting talk. I work on the marine protection side of things, and my question is, can we classify plastics themselves as harmful or only in addition with the additives on them? I remember that very popular document long ago, Classify Plastics as Hazardous, which caused long discussions. And my question is microplastics just themselves as a material having any chemical effects in addition to the mechanical effects, or only in addition and in combination with the additives, chemicals added to them? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That is definitely a very good question, and I was almost anticipating this, that the view or the idea that basically the plastic polymer is a separate thing from the additives. And to my knowledge, there are no plastics that don't contain any additives. So it is integrally linked. So in that sense, not sure how much we need to consider the topics separately. Having said that, of course, the microplastics and the small particles would have like the physiological type of, or like the physical type of toxicity, like any particle pollution, causing damage in the cells, inflammation, release of cytokines, oxidative stress, likely leading to damage in the DNA. So that would be just any type of particles that enter the system. But always together with the plastics, there will also be a cocktail of chemicals that are additives, and in the microplastics from the oceans, it would be also the absorbed chemicals. So I think it will be very challenging to tease these two aspects apart.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Luisa?
Hi, thank you very much. This question's for Dr. Paulina Dandipulo. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly. Thank you all for the very interesting presentations. I come from the legal background, so maybe my question is a bit shallow from your perspective, but I was conducting an investigation about the legal regulation for bisphenol, and it's mostly about BPA that you have also mentioned. And as far as I could understand, there are already alternatives from industry, for example, BPF and BPS. So they are taking this road now that especially Europe and other countries start to regulate BPA. But as far as I could understand, they have similar negative impacts in human health and nature. So I would like to know if that's indeed the case and why we are not looking at these substances as well, and we only target BPA. Thank you very much.
That is just a fantastic question. I'm really happy you brought it up because this is exactly the issue with chemicals, the regrettable substitution. When we finally agree that something is harmful, then the next chemical of the same type will appear in the products. This is a known problem, and it's based on the fact that, first of all, we have already about 100,000 chemicals registered, and they can be used because they are already there, even if there is no safety data associated. So the requirements for the testing have not really lived up to the requirements from the society health point of view. And for example, in the EU, the new chemical strategy was released last fall, and there's the revolutionary idea that chemicals should be regulated as families of similar chemicals. And the first group of chemicals that might now undergo a regulation like this in the European Union is the PFAS chemicals. This is the perfluorinated chemicals that are surface active. They are in the Teflon pans, Gore-Tex shoes, in the kitchenware, firefighting foam, and they have led to many environmental scandals, both in the US and in Sweden. And it's also a group of 5,000 chemicals. We have managed to put 2 of them to the Stockholm Convention, and then 4,700 remain. So it's not sustainable to go chemical by chemical. But as long as we don't have better requirements and legislation in place, this is exactly what the industry will be doing. They will just take the next chemical that looks the same and keep on using it until a researcher figures out that, oh, this is also toxic. And typically this takes 30 years. It's been said that it takes 3 months to get a new chemical to the market and 30 years to take it off the market because it's dependent on the academic research and enough information out there. And for example, bisphenol A is the most studied chemical in the world. There's so many academic papers out there, and still we cannot agree. You always have the other side who says that the evidence is not strong enough and there could be confounding factors, it could be something else. And part of it really comes with the endocrine disruptive properties of having, for example, early life exposure, which is impossible to link to an adult woman who suffers from infertility. Which one of us knows what your mother was using when she was pregnant with you? So there's like a fundamental difficulty in understanding the endocrine system, the type of toxicity chemicals cause when they disrupt the endocrine system, and bringing this to the regulatory context, and then going away from this chemical by chemical approach, which is not going to lead us anywhere. So I even forgot what the original question was, but yeah, I think we need just better regulations to really look at the chemicals as families instead of single compounds, to avoid the regrettable substitution.
Thank you, Paulina. No, I think this is a very central question, not only in the plastics agenda, but in the entire environmental agenda. I mean, these effects are somewhere in the future, and that means it's nearly impossible to get political attention. I mean, I always draw parallels between the environmental climate change realm and then what has happened over the last 12 months. And how much money that has been mobilized very fast from countries because the very imminent threat from the pandemic. And I think so. I mean, I think there's going to be some very interesting lessons to be learned from that, and maybe we can learn see if we can draw just a few of those buttons and learn how to push them in the environmental agenda, because it is needed, but it's very hard to say, well, you might be sick in 20 years. I mean, it's very hard to tell, unfortunately, huh?
Or if you see that there is the lost IQ points, let's say the population IQ average goes down 5 points. It's not like everybody becomes very intellectually disabled, but on the population level, we lose the very gifted people and we have a higher population of the ones who need help. So also endocrine endpoints are not the typical diseases of cancer or death. It could be just like less cognitive function, for example, a bit more difficulty getting pregnant. So it's not the traditional disease codes you can put to these things at the doctor's office, which makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, it's indeed something that is it's hard to measure, and that makes it hard to make a case, right? When we don't have the data points, we have some guesses, some good guesses, I guess, based on science, but still, it's not a solid data point that can be referenced and make, you know, inform political changes. I think that's the main issue there. I saw I got a question on how much money there is for plastic in the environmental agenda. I cannot say, I don't know, because that, I mean, what countries are putting into this is very different. I think the European community has put a lot of money into plastics and the plastic agenda, European countries, but I'm not sure what the actual amount is, because there are some overarching, say, that these blue plants that are being developed. The trouble is, this is not only blue. It's not only what's in the ocean. I think it all happens on land. It happens in households. I mean, so the amount of money that's spent here on trying to curb these issues, I don't have the number, unfortunately. I can just see that apparently it's not enough, and apparently it is, and I think it goes back to the lack of political will to face the issues. I mean, one thing is you can do all the visual plastics in the sea. That's easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's easy. It's an easy convincing argument. But when it comes to these microplastics and nanoplastics, and especially the endocrine disruption, that's a harder sell, right? And it's not something that's visible. So then it becomes really hard. I have for a long time trying to fight getting more focus on wastewater, because I think that would also assist in these issues, right? If we could have proper wastewater systems, a lot of these issues would be solved. But just saying, it's not easy because it's not visible. Are there any additional questions? I know we have a few more minutes left. I mean, I was wondering, I mean, we had 78 people, we have 70 people on the call. I'm just wondering if there's anyone that would just highlight in a minute what is being done in the country you're sitting in on these issues. To me, that would at least be an important part of for informing UNDP's process of this plastic proposal, or whatever you call it. Plastic. What was it again? Plastic call.
It's plastics offer.
The plastic offer. Yeah, exactly. Plastic offer. So I'm just wondering if there's any input to this.
Right. We are also organizing regional webinars so that we can hear from colleagues working at the country offices and to share their experiences. But I've seen a few of project managers here, and I know some projects, perhaps they are shy.
That's okay.
Colleagues, please.
But other than that, I mean, I would at least encourage you to make sure you send your reflections on the session today, but also the reflection on this topic and these two distinct but very connected issues that's been discussed today, because I think they may hold part of the solution for us to get some more political attention to these issues. And of course, one thing that would be very nice to have here would be also the private sector. I know this is an internal session, but I do think that when we look at the amount of plastic being produced, it's going to be really hard to do any changes unless we have them on board. So if nothing else, then I would be very happy to, if there's any final thoughts from the two speakers, Paulina or Julian. No? Well, with that, then I just want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to join you today. I know that the person that should have been sitting in my chair has now joined us, so I can get an evaluation from him afterwards if I totally flunked. But otherwise, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for letting me, get half an hour to learn something on issues that is normally not. I don't have time to normally sit down and do this. So this is fantastic. I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody else got a lot out of it too. I think this is a good beginning. It's definitely not the end. So with that, thank you so much. I'll hand over back to you, Solan.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much, Julian and Paulina, for your very informative and inspiring presentations. I think we got even more motivated to do something here, and the pictures you have painted are not very rosy, and I think if we take a minute to think about it, it's very scary, and then we just continue to live our life as if nothing happens, and it's actually hurting us quietly. So with that, I think our team here, together with our colleagues who cannot join, I think we will be more informed and more empowered in making and developing our offer. Here, I would also like to invite colleagues to make your contribution on the Spark Blue platform. All the presentations and webinar recording will be uploaded there. And we use this opportunity to also connect with you, people in the field and the thought leaders, world leading scientists like Julian and Paulina. I think UNDP has this global network. We can think globally, act locally. And with the support and the partnership with the Jeff and other international organizations, we can work together. For that purpose, we have also established a community of practice within UNDP. That is like an internal sharing group, as well as a friends and family group, including colleagues that we have invited and experts like Julian and Paulina. So for those of you who are within the UNDP, we'll include you in that group. And experts and leaders from outside the UNDP, we will include you in the friends and family group. So you will hear from us going forward. I think this is just a way of organizing ourselves and coordinating our work towards a shared vision. With that, I want to thank my colleagues from the task force who have helped to organize this webinar series. Thanks so much, Martin, Miri, Amro, and all the colleagues of the task force. And thank you again for Chris for moderating this very fun session. You promised to make it fun. It's fun. Thank you for sharing some jokes. Thanks so much, Julian and Paulina, again. We look forward to hearing your more advanced, as you advance your research, come back to share with us on your latest findings. And last but not least, thanks everyone who has joined this journey, and as we go together, we hope to learn together with you. Thank you, everyone, and happy New Year of the Ox. It has to be a better year for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you to all.
Thank you very much, Larry.